Verbos reflexivos, rutina diaria, or rutina cotidiana. These are reflexive verbs that for the most part discuss your daily routine, to wake up, to get up, and to go to bed. In this lesson, we'll look at how to form these reflexive verbs, and we'll see a list of very common verbs that are in the reflexive. The words on the following list are all reflexive verbs. Casarse, for example, means to get married. Lavarse is to wash yourself. Sentarse is to sit down. Levantarse is to stand up. Fijarse means to check something out. Preocuparse means to be worried. Notice that each one of these verbs has the pronoun se attached to the end of the infinitive. Se simply means oneself. So the first verb is to marry oneself, to wash oneself, to sit oneself, to stand oneself, to check oneself out, and to preoccupy oneself. A specific list of reflexive verbs are daily routine words or rutina diaria. For example, despertarse is to wake up. Ducharse, to shower. Secarse is to dry yourself off. Cepillarse is to brush. Mirarse is to look at yourself. And acostarse is to go to bed. Notice again they all have the pronoun se or oneself at the end of each verb. Let's conjugate one of these verbs, casarse, to get married, so you can see how they conjugate throughout the entire paradigm. We'll put casarse up here, and notice it's an AR verb. It's a regular AR verb, and it conjugates just as it normally would. Caso, casas, casa, casamos, casais, and casan. And notice to get married is to make a house with, to casa yourself, casarse. Once you put se at the end of a verb, however, it becomes reflexive. Let's see how we conjugate a reflexive verb. Instead of yo, tú, él, nosotros, vosotros, and ellos out in front of a verb, those are the subject pronouns, we're going to use reflexive pronouns instead. For example, me caso means myself I marry, or I marry myself. That's why they are called reflexive. They reflect back onto yourself. Instead of tú casas, it's te casas. You marry yourself. Instead of él casa, se casa is how you would say that. He marries himself. Nos casamos. We marry ourselves. Os casais. Y'all marry yourselves. And se casan. They marry themselves. So instead of subject pronouns, we're going to have reflexive pronouns come before the conjugated verb. Me caso, te casas, se casa, nos casamos, os casais, and se casan. Notice what each of the reflexive pronouns means in English. Me is myself, te is yourself, se is himself or herself, nos is ourselves, os is yourselves, and se is themselves. That's what each one of these reflexive pronouns means. Me, te, se, nos, os, se. Se on its own means oneself. So when we look at casarse, to marry oneself, this is how we'll conjugate the verb. Me caso, te casas, se casa, nos casamos, os casais, and se casan. If you want to put this in a full sentence, I marry Bob, in Spanish it won't be I marry Bob. It's I marry myself with Bob. You marry yourself with Bob. It's not you marry Bob, it's te casas con Bob. And in English, that's how it would sound. I marry myself with Bob. You marry yourself with Bob. He marries himself with Bob. In English, we would just simply say, I marry Bob. But you can't say that in Spanish. You can't say, I marry Bob. Caso Bob. That's not how you say it in Spanish. You say, me caso, or I marry myself with Bob. Me caso con Bob. That's the beginning of our lessons on how to use reflexive verbs in Spanish. Verbos reflexivos, rutina diaria.